All right. Anyways, all right. Why don't we get started here? All right. Let me try this, and we'll see how well this works. I want to get a sense of how many people are already familiar with DSC. So if you can just hit F, I guess. All right. And then now, how many people are familiar with MCP? All right. So that's kind of what I expected. All right. So now, let me put my slides here. Here we go. So thanks for all the sponsors. I think Minicom did a great little tiny conference, and it makes it easy because I can do it from home. All right, so let me give a little bit about myself. And yes, all the images in this deck are AI generated to go with the theme of MCP. And I'm going to talk more about DSC and MCP in a little bit here. But about me, I've been at Microsoft for more than 25 years. Different products, so not the same thing. But I've always been in the system management space. I actually started in the WMI team when we were doing an NT4 release. So that kind of dates how old I am. And then I worked through like WinRM and other products. But currently, I'm the engineer manager for PowerShell 7, for PowerShell Gallery, DSCv3, which is the topic on this presentation, Windows port of OpenSSH, AI Shell, and a bunch of other modules and stuff like the VS Code extension and things like that. Let's see. So I think this will work. There we go. So there's a little video I generated Sora of myself. All right. I actually tried to create something better, but I gave up after a few attempts. And so that's the best I could come up with. All right. All right. For this talk, this is the agenda at a high level. So I am going to kind of give a brief overview of DSC, specifically v3, if you're not already familiar with that. Then we're going to dig more into details of MCP, and I'm going to explain what those letters stand for later. I'm going to go over like what's the motivation for starting the whole MCP and DSC effort. I'm going to go over some of the learnings I've had through, if you want to build your own MCP server, like what are some things that you should consider. I'm going to talk about the specific tools that are available, at least in the preview that's released. There's more that have come in since then. Of course, we're going to try to spend as much time as we can in the demo section, talk about what's going to come after, and then the call to action for the audience, and then anyone actually going to watch this recording later, and then some time at the end for Q&A. All right, so let's get started. So DSC. So desired state configuration. This is a evolution. Actually, it's more than evolution. It's probably more like a revolution of the old DSC v1 and v2, if you're already familiar with that. But essentially, it is a declarative and idempotent. Idempotent here meaning that if you continue to reapply the configuration, then there should be no side effects. Of course, a lot of that depends on the resources themselves being idempotent. But this is the way we recommend to manage settings, right? There's two different aspects of DSCv3. So here's the first one. One of the reasons we reimagined DSC is we wanted a simpler way to author resources, because that does most of the work. And in the old DSC v1 and v2 world, basically a lot of people wrote PowerShell resources, and we still, and I'll go over that later, but we still support writing PowerShell resources. But what we learned talking to partners and other large enterprises is a lot of their teams are more naturally writing in other programming languages. So DSCv3 allows you to do it whatever your engineering team is familiar with. So you can do it in Rust, Go, C++, C#, whatever you want. But again, you can still do it in PowerShell. Alternating language. Another thing that is different from the old DSC is that we moved away from Moth, which was heavily used by SIM. And if you have questions about that, we can talk about that in detail later. Not really that relevant here, but basically adopting industry standards, right? I think JSON and JSON schema basically have one. I'm not a huge fan of either, but they work sufficiently, and there's a lot of tooling around it, so it's very easy to use. As I mentioned, PowerShell is still supported. The other aspect of DSCv3 is, again, moving away from the configuration keyword and writing a PowerShell script that generates a Moth. Instead, we have, in my opinion, well, it's different, but in some ways, simpler way to author configuration files. We can go over some more of these in detail later if we have time towards the Q&A section. But again, we're adopting JSON, and YAML is another way you can do this. JSON and YAML is effectively interchangeable. The other big thing is that we're aligning with ARM template syntax. So if you're already familiar with using ARM templates, then some of the examples I might show later should be very familiar. Although this will obviously not be deployed in Azure, but deployed on a local machine. And because we are aligning with ARM, that means that we do get bicep support. It's still a work in progress. All right, so let's go into MCP. And by the way, if anyone has any questions during the presentation, just feel free to step into the Q&A and feel free to ask your question. Otherwise, you can also, we'll have time at the end as well. So first off, MCP, it just stands for Model Context Protocol. This is basically a industry standard for producing what's called MCP servers that host tools. Basically, the way to think about it is, if you've been watching the news and stuff like that, there's this whole large language model, right? LLMs and this is what AI is happening in the industry. And so these large language models are trained off of natural language. And depending on the particular model, they can have a large set of parameters. I'm not going to dig into the details of a large language model, but the basic idea is you have a large language model that's been trained over time. There's a cutoff date when it's done training, and its knowledge base is based on everything that it's learned, right? So you can ask it questions about the past, and it's usually reasonable giving you answers. I'm going to not dive into the whole hallucination problem. But if you actually want to use a language model, which we're referring to as agents here, to do something else. So for example, you may want to say, what are the top issues I have on GitHub, right? Or what are my work items for today from my calendar, stuff like that. So you need a way for that language model to interpret your natural language request and do something with what I call the real world, right? So this is where tools and MCP comes in. So, and some of these tools already exist. For example, there is a GitHub MCP server where basically if you connect it to your client, and during the demo, I'll show you the client I use. But you can ask it to do this stuff, and it's going to use your credentials for the most part and access this thing and do some results. All right. There's other aspects of MCP that I'm not going to dive into, and these are things I'm also learning for myself. So I'm not an expert in this space. But besides tools, so tools are things to allow a language model to interact with the real world. It could be the file system. It could be accessing a web browser, GitHub, Azure, whatever the case may be. Resources and prompts are other aspects of an MCP server that is more tuned for a particular application or for users to use, which is not something I'm going to dive into here. The other aspect is, although an MCP server can be exposed via HTTP, meaning that you could have an MCP server sitting in the cloud, and your local agent can do stuff with it. In this case, if you're doing anything locally, then the two, abbreviations you should be aware of is JSON RPC. So JSON, so this JavaScript object notation, and then RPC is remote procedure call. This is just a standard way of packaging requests and responses in JSON. And then standard IO, it simply means you're spawning a separate process and you're using standard in, standard out, and standard error to do communication. And that's how the DSC MCP server is implemented. And I do want to caution everyone who starts exploring using MCP servers, don't use any MCP servers that you didn't get from a trusted source, because obviously once you allow a language model to start doing stuff on your behalf, where it's touching your file system, accessing the web, it's an attack vector from a hacker perspective. All right. So let me quickly go over how this MCP project with DSC first started. So I believe it was at MVP Summit early this year, where I was doing a presentation on DSCv3. And at home, I am a fan of dark mode on my laptop, on my desktop, whatever the case may be. And when I get up on stage, first thing I notice is, hey, there's a projector for the screen for my presentation. And guess what? Dark mode is awful for projectors. I need to switch to light mode. So then I normally don't switch my theme. So now I'm on stage trying to go through, VS Code settings, Windows Terminal settings and stuff like that to figure out where the theme is to switch it. And so I was thinking, you know what? It would be nice if I can just ask Copilot in the Windows case, I want to get my laptop ready for presentation mode, right? And so light theme is only one aspect. So for example, I would also expect it to maybe increase my fonts. I may also expect it to close down Teams and Outlook because I don't want any kind of company information to pop up during the presentation, stuff like that. Maybe it has a way to look at my PowerPoint and see what actually is relevant for my presentation. So maybe only keep VS Code and Terminal up, stuff like that, right? So there's a lot of context that it needs. And just so everyone knows, I'm not going to give a demo where that works. Okay, this is still, there's a lot of work from here to there to get that scenario working, but that's the original motivation for me. Is like, there's a real world problem I want to solve, which is how can I just tell my laptop, hey, get in presentation mode, it discovers a bunch of DSC settings, it changes it, and then when I'm done, I want to tell it, get it back to my normal setting, and everything goes back to normal. That's the end goal eventually that I want to get to. All right. So let me just go over a couple of points for anyone who may be interested in running an MCP server for yourselves. Again, writing an MCP server is actually not difficult because there are a lot of SDKs available for different languages. We don't have an SDK yet for PowerShell, although one of my engineers, Dombo, did have a proof of concept where he demoed to my team writing an MCP server as a PowerShell module. That may or may not be something we will publish in the future. But once you get past the SDK part, a couple of things that you should consider, and these are considerations we had made on the DSC side. One is this thing called tokens. All right, so I have to dive a little bit deeper to explain what a token is. So in a large language model, the way most of them work today is that they are basically predicting the next token. So what is a token? A token is a fragment of a word. All right, it's not a whole word, but it's a fragment. So it's usually like 2 to 3 letters long. And basically the way it works is that you ask it something, and based on its training, it's trying to figure out what's the most likely token to satisfy a response. And then it basically recursively feeds back what it already predicted to get the next token. All right. So eventually it's going to hit a null character, meaning everything's done, or it's going to hit a token limit. All right. The newer models have much bigger allowance for tokens, whereas the earlier models are much smaller. But in any case, whenever you return output from a tool, that does consume tokens. So you do have to be considerate of, don't just emit everything. You got to think about what is pertinent to the language model to do its job. You also got to think about how large language models actually work. So at least currently, a lot of them upfront, quote unquote, they call it the thinking model. They think about a to-do list and say, all right, here's your user ask. Here, I'm going to produce a to-do list like A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then it's kind of walk through those things. So again, you got to think differently in terms of how you expose your tools. You're not exposing your tools for humans. You're exposing your tools for agents. So it does require you to think a little bit differently. That's the next thing. The other thing is, don't automatically map your tools to an API. Like it's no different in some cases. Like, how do you build a PowerShell commandlet? A horrible PowerShell commandlet is one that directly maps to an API. You really should think of it as task or use case based. So it's trying to do something. And this is the same for tools that you expose via MCP. The way a large language model quote unquote understands the world is through natural language. So the more information you can provide in the descriptions of your tools and output and errors and stuff like that, the more successful it's going to be. And again, this is something we need to improve upon on the DSC MCP side as I start playing with it. Yeah, like I said, error messages, things will naturally fail because the language model doesn't quite understand certain things. It'll try something out and it'll fail. And in your error message, the more information you give back to the language model to figure out what it should do next, the more successful it's going to be. Definitely err on the side of providing more context than necessary, keeping in mind the token considerations. All right, so let's now jump into the tools that are currently available in the latest preview. There actually may be I don't remember now off the top of my head if I merged some more, but these are the first 4 that kind of started this whole thing. And I know that there's been some PRs up, and I'll get into that in a bit. So first one is simply a way for an agent to say, hey, what DC resources are available on my system, right? And then the next one is, well, actually, you know what? I actually have individual slides for each of these. So let me just jump forward. All right. The first one is just list the DC resources, and I'll show some of the equivalents during the demo section. But basically, again, this is just show what DC resources are available. In the DSCv3 world, we have this concept called an adapter. So this is how PowerShell resources work, but also we're building out like a Python adapter as well. So once you get a particular resource that may be appropriate for the user task that they're requesting, then show DSC resource gets detailed information about that resource, right? So it'll get like the description stuff, but also like the schema. You'll know the language model will know more about what the capabilities are, whether it supports get, set, test, export, things like that. And then now invoke DC resources, how the language model can enact action. So whether it's get, set, test, or export, it can actually do that directly against the resource. And yeah, I got Heiss's picture. Well, I got Heiss's picture from GitHub here. But basically, I want to call it because he actually added this contribution to the repo. And this is kind of in preparation for where the MCP aspect of DSC moves away from direct resource invocation towards configuration. So I think that's going to be, and I'll talk more about that later as well. But basically, this just allows it to enumerate all the functions of it. And I'll go a little bit more into that during the demo section as well. All right. Before getting into demos, I'm going to be honest, I spent not a considerable amount of time, but I did spend some time trying to get the prompting to get the output I want, and I could not get it to do what I want to do. So during the demo, it will be live, meaning that it's not going to be completely polished because I couldn't get it to do what I want to do. And I'll go into what I mean later when I get into the actual demo. But okay, I'm going to show 3 things here. The first one is this tool called MCP Inspector. Then I'm going to show how to connect. Specifically, I'm using VS Code, so VS Code agent mode to connect to the DSC MCP server and how you can do it for yourself. And finally, I'm going to talk more in detail, like how do we do testing of the MCP server, which we're using Pester tests. And the Pester tests actually implement a lightweight JSON RPC client to do that. So let me, how do I do this? I need to, 1 second, I'm going to use my Windows machine. Here we go. All right. So the first thing is MCP Inspector. So I think I have this built. Oh, is this not going to cooperate with me today? Let me see. There we go. So MCP Inspector is a tool. I'll it's a little bit bigger, although we're not going to be using the terminal for this. So this is a node based tool. And basically this allows you to easily validate whether or not the inputs and outputs for your JSON RPC for your MCP server is correct. So I'll just click on this URL. Make this bigger. I'll make the font bigger as well. Okay. So you can kind of see in this case, I'm using standard IO. I'm connecting to, in this case, the one I'm building off of the main branch. And the only arguments is MCP. So basically you run DSC with a single argument MCP and it'll start up in MCP mode. And here I can do connect. And so this is basically spawning the DSC process with this argument, and now it's connected. So you can kind of see here, it's an initialize request, and then this is the response that the MCP server responded with. And I'm using the R, which is Rust MCP SDK to do this. And this is where I probably need to put a lot more content to help the agent understand DSC and how to use it. So maybe I'll do that as a PR coming up. But one of the first things you can do is you can list tools. Oh yeah, so in this build I only have those 4. So if you click on a single tool, then it shows you what you can do. So let's start with list DSC resources. And this also includes like the output schema. But if I just run this tool, so again, what's happening is that in the browser, it is connected to the DSC process and it's using JSON RPC to talk to it. And this is the output that you get. Right. So in this case, if I were to bring this, this up, let me open up a new window. Close DSC. Let me add, I need to add that. So if I do DC resource list here, then this is the equivalent of what I just ran in this tool. So you can see, since I've made a font bigger, I've kind of messed up the formatting. I run this again. And by the way, a lot of these tools that you see here are not ones that we ship. These are only used for testing. So these are all in the repo, but they're not ones that we ship. But there's a bunch of other ones, and there's some that are repeated, and I feel like there's a bug that should not exist, but I'll need to fix. Basically, it's finding it for both the one I built and another one that I have installed from the store and probably from somewhere else as well, which is why they're repeating, because they're all the same version. So going back here, so this basically is that same list, with the exception that if you look again in, here, there's a lot of other information here. And again, going back to the token considerations, basically I stripped out stuff I didn't think was really pertinent to language model. So we really just return the name, which is the most important, what kind of resource, because it has to know if something's an adapter. The description is important, and then whether it requires an adapter to actually work. So here, if I were to put PowerShell, so this is a PowerShell adapter. I run it again, then it's basically going to enumerate all of the PowerShell 7 compatible resources. And you kind of see there's a few in here. I don't have too many installed. Let me see anything else. I can just show this one real quick. This is an easy one. So again, these are all the functions. And this is a pretty large list, so it's actually probably easier for me to show the equivalent from the command line function list. So you can see like there's a lot of, again, we can dive more into this if there's interest later towards the Q&A section, but this is used for a DSC configuration where you have this concept of an expression. So if you want to do stuff like conditionals and whatever, if you're trying to create property values at runtime that are not statically defined, you would create an expression, and then you have all these functions that you can use. And most of these functions are simply ones that exist in ARM, but there are a few where is it? Should be under system. All these two down here, like environmental variable and system root, are ones that only make sense in DSC, doesn't make sense in ARM. So these are custom to DSC. All right, let's see. I guess I'll just show this one as well real quick. So this is, so let's pick something like, oops, next off DSC. But Echo, there's an Echo resource that I use quite a bit in the test to simply just return what the input was. And again, this is intended so that the language model can say, is this resource really the right one to use? And this one supports get, set, test, export. There's a description for it, and then there's a JSON schema so that the language model knows how to craft the input for it. So now let's jump into VS Code. So let's go into view chat. So again, if you're using the latest VS Code, you should be able to use agent mode. And agent mode is an MCP client. So the first thing, if you want to do the DSC stuff, and I have to remember where I set this up. I think it's here, MCP servers. And here, I created this myself. So there are other MCP servers that are available to download, but I don't care about those for the purpose of this demo. So here, I have to make this, again, very similar to what you saw in the MCP inspector tool. It just needs the command line, meaning the executable, and the single argument, which is MCP, is using standard IO for communication. And once you have that set up, then we can talk to Copilot. So let's try a few things. And again, one other thing I'll mention before I start typing here, with large language models, there's a concept called temperature. And honestly, I don't remember whether high or low temperature means one or the other, but basically it kind of controls the creativity for a language model. So in general, the same request will not give you the exact same response, and that's intended. So therefore, I don't know exactly what it's going to say. All right, that's my disclaimer for whatever happens next. All right, first thing I can say is let's try this. What PowerShell based resources are installed? Let's see if it can do that. So what's going to happen is it's going to first interpret what I'm trying to ask it for. In this case, it did find my MCP server. This is not going to work because this is not the correct type name, so I'll allow it. So one of the things, going back to like safety and security, MCP tools that are properly written are attributed whether or not either a read-only operation or a quote unquote write operation that could be destructive, and then which requires permission. So this red X means it failed because guess what? So can I show? Okay, so it tried to do this thing called PowerShell, and this is the error it actually received. Like adapter PowerShell does not exist. And honestly, the error message, somewhere it says here, like so this is part of the tool description, and I tried to. These are things I'm trying to make it work better. So if a desired resource is not found, try listing with the Microsoft.DSC. Like I gave it the name of the adapter you should try. So this is now going to enumerate Okay. So I think actually, why did it not succeed? It has the whole hint right here. But anyways, here it is now running the list DSC resource. Again, if you expand this, it tells you exactly what it did. And it got, all the top level ones that are non-adapter based. All right, I don't need to go through all that output. Let's go down here. All right, so it did find a bunch of stuff. PowerShell script-based resource, PowerShell adapters, key features. All right. So one of the interesting things I found, so if I go back to my motivation and my initial scenario, right? So let me just ask, can you use DSC to change Windows into light mode? So before I actually put that in, there is a resource I deliberately installed, which is a PowerShell-based resource written by, I think it was the Power Toys team who wrote this. And this is the Windows setting resource. All right, so it is, well, it's this one here. All right, so if I were to actually run this directly, so I have it already here. I'm already in dark mode, so I'm going to change this to light mode. All right, so this already exposes the way. Now, one of the things you may notice, like the JSON proper, they call it a system color mode. So maybe that's something that I need to help the language model understand, like that is the Windows theme, like maybe it's not connecting those dots. But if I were to run this directly, doing a set operation, so basically I'm using this resource to say, change the system color mode to light. Then you can kind of see down here, right, change it to light. It says system color mode was dark before, and now it is light, right? So it tells you before and after. And the only thing that changed, because there's other stuff you can change, is the system color mode. So let's change it back to dark real quick. All right, so we'll see that change in a second. And then when it changes, I'm going to ask Copilot here, which is using Claude Sonnet 4, which is supposed to be one of the more advanced language models. Let's see what it comes out with. And I have a guess of what it's going to come out with. And as it goes, I'm going to explain. Yeah, it's going to try to go to the Windows registry. So what I find is, because it's been trained on a lot of information available on the internet, it has an affinity for some reason because it knows it can do it via the registry, to use the registry. So if I say allow, then, because it obviously found the registry DSC resource, so it can use that to directly touch the registry. So let's see so now here it is literally getting the schema and stuff for the Windows registry resource. Great, the registry can help us change. And then it also found the PowerShell script resource, which again, it keeps doing this over and over. So actually, I guess I'll allow that as well. My rendering's kind of messed up here, but all right. So now it kind of came with two approaches, and the one it recommends is it's going to go directly to registry. Now in this case, well, it's covering both apps and system. But it also came up with a PowerShell script, but the PowerShell script just uses a registry anyway. So it seems like not really a great example. So now, and it said, would you like me to create a complete DC configuration file to use? So I can say, don't use the Windows registry directly, and avoid writing a PowerShell script if this is where I might have to be a little more specific for it to try to find the Windows settings one. Let's go like this. I'm going to get a lot of hints here. Microsoft.DSC PowerShell adapted resource and manage Windows settings. Let's see what happens. Okay, so now it's going to enumerate resources that are PowerShell based. So this time it should find the Windows settings one. Oh, for some reason it's going to now want to run. Interesting. This didn't happen for me the other times. It's going to try to run DSC commandlet. Get rid of that. We don't need that. I mean, this also shows the Windows settings one, but I don't know why it didn't find it with just the previous call. All the way down here. All right. So I did find a Windows settings one. I don't want it to use the commandlets. So, and you use, let me see. Can you use the tool to upload DSC instead? The PowerShell template. All right, so now that I've given it, okay, so, well, it's going to repeat some stuff. So it's going to refine the resources. What's it doing now? Why does it need to run it twice? That's weird. Oh, actually, no, it's running the command versus the tool. So it needs, for some reason, I must have hit an error. Oh, I did hit an error. You can kind of see in here, this is exactly what it's running, and it hit an error because what happened? Pass dash just format as a value. It should be output format. Oh yeah, I fixed it here. So it's not clear to me right now, why is it trying to call the shell versus using the tool? So there's some more work to be done to get it, but it finally got to what I want. So let's allow that. So now it looks like it's going to try to create a DC configuration for this. It got the detailed information about the Windows setting. Okay, so it's trying to do a get. I'm going to do a quick time check. I think we're good. Okay, so it's not going to succeed because it keeps hitting errors on. Basically, it is imagining incorrect. There's no what if for get. There's only a what if for set. That's why that failed, and now it wants to get help information. So it figured it out to remove the what if because it's not appropriate for get. All right. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it did figure out all the properties, and you can see here it did generate a config file. I guess maybe I wasn't very explicit about apps versus system, but I guess it makes sense for it to try to do both. So this should actually work, but I'm not going to have it. Or it's actually doing a test. So doing a test is perfectly fine because I won't have any actual impact to my system. But you can kind of see all the output that's happening here. It says yes, correctly. Current is dark. Actually, we can let it try it. It should change it to light, so this should just work. See, so you can see it change to the light. All right, so I think the key takeaway here is there's still a lot of work to be done for it to have a better understanding of the user intent and how to leverage more of DSC to do it versus going directly command line instead of using a tool, trying to use a registry and scripts instead of using available resources and stuff. So let me now jump to the last part of my demo, which is Pester. So let's close these things. All right, and the file I'm about to show is checked into the repo. So under tests, DSC MCP tests. Okay, so let me go to the very top here to explain what's going on. So before going through the details here, so basically, if you're familiar with language server protocol, LSPs, these are things that are used by VS Code to understand C# versus PowerShell script versus something. So it's a similar kind of model where you have a long running process and it's going to get requests and then it's going to have responses back. In the case of MCP, all the requests and responses are asynchronous, meaning that it's going to spawn DSC MCP, and it can send multiple requests and get multiple responses. So, and this is using JSON RPC. So there's a well-established protocol. So the first thing I got to do before all the tests is I need to spawn DSC with the MCP argument to get it in MCP mode. The only additional thing I put in here is I want the traces that come out of it, if any come out on standard error, to be just to be in plain text, because otherwise it may have ANSI escape sequences for coloring and stuff like that. Again, this is all just PowerShell script. I want to make sure I definitely don't use shell execute. I want to redirect standard error output and input so that I can handle it within the script itself and I can dump to the console. I'm going to start that process. And then I have a helper function here that allows me to send a MCP request. And then the request is going to be a hash table. I'm just going to convert that to JSON. And then I send it to standard in, which is how the MCP server is going to receive it. I want to make sure I flush so that it definitely got sent. There's other stuff in here that may not be pertinent, but basically there's an idea of a notification. So these are like events via JSON RPC. So if it is not a notification, then I don't need to go through this additional work. If it is a notification, I need to wait for a response. Let me see. Okay, so, and then after all the tests are done, then I want to, if I close standard input, that should close out the MCP server because it tells it that there's no more input that ever going to come. And then I just wait for the exit of that process. All right, so let's go into these tests to kind of maybe dig more into JSON RPC and how this all works. So here's the MCP request. And again, it's easy to write as a PowerShell hash table, but this will get converted to JSON at runtime. So if you recall from here, right, this, oh, by the way, this output that you see down here is very helpful, but is not JSON. Obviously, there would have to be quotes around this for this to be JSON. So this is kind of like a more human readable rendering of JSON. But in here, this is the actual JSON that's required. So JSON RPC 2.0. Because there's asynchronous messages, meaning that messages can be coming and going together at the same time. You need to have an ID. So every request, the response will have the same ID. This is just a JSON RPC method called initialize. I'm telling it I'm using this protocol version. And then I'm requesting, do you support this capability, which is tools? And this is anything I can provide from my client. So I could have called this Pester test client, I guess. And it's going to send it. And then for the simple initialization, it's going to expect these output. And then if you go back here, so it's going to send this stuff, but there is one thing you don't see here, which is going to cause the MCP server to block, is that the client needs to send this notification, meaning that the client is ready to interact with the MCP server, right? So if you don't send this, meaning that the client's initialized, then you can't send any requests. So that's what this is for. All right. So going into the actual test now. So here, doing a tool list is simply this method called tool list. There's no parameters given to it. And in this case, we're just checking to make sure all of these tools get returned. So as we add more tools to the MCP server, then obviously this test will be enhanced to add those things. And then we do some checking here. In our case, let's see, this one is not that one of those cases, but let me skip down to listing DSC resources. Again, we're calling a specific MCP tool. And because internally the tool is just calling other functions, public functions within DSC executable, then we expect the output to be very similar to if we ran DSC resource lists directly, right? And we know that we only need certain information, which is here. And so that's how we do that testing and checking. So that's essential. And if you look through these tests, you can kind of see they're all kind of very similar in that regard, where we basically keep incrementing the ID as we go through each test. And we're using the send MCP request helper to craft it as JSON and send it to our process. I don't know if there's anything else in here that is worth calling out. Yeah, so these are just more complicated tests. All right, so let me go back to the presentation. All right. Hold on one sec. Okay, let me just finish this up and then we'll get to Q&A. So what's next? We do have planned for more tools, and there are already a few PRs from Heis up there waiting to be merged. Again, I think the next big thing is having it work with configuration. So as you saw in the demo, like the agent knows about configurations and it is using the shell, meaning that it's using the terminal to do all this stuff. It's creating the file. But I think we wanted to sometimes create files to persist as an example, but sometimes we want to be able to interact directly with the MCP tool versus always going to the terminal to do this work. Uh, it somehow knows about what if, and maybe it knew about it by looking at the help for the tool. But we do want it to for safety of it trying to do things, we do want it to leverage DSC's what if mode before it does a set to see what might happen, to see if it actually is what the user is asking for. We have this thing that we're in process of developing, but it's not a small project, which we call the RDK. This is the Resource Development Kit. So we do expect to have it for a lot of the common languages that we think users will want. So, for example, obviously C#, but also Rust, Go, and Python, and PowerShell might be some of the top ones. But we do want to be able to support having you use Copilot or whatever client you use to ask it to generate a DSC resource for something. So I think as part of helping agents and language models use DSC more effectively, we do need to add more to probably the resource manifest. So, for example, we probably need to have explicit. So these are things that humans may not ever use because it may not be useful. It may or may not be useful for them. But for example, it may have to be more explicit about example scenarios. That way, the language model could have more easily connected the Windows setting PowerShell-based resource to what I was asking versus directly going to the registry. So maybe better examples of potential inputs for a resource and also best practices for that. In terms of call to action, so here's what I would love to see from this audience, and again, anyone watching the recording later. So definitely, author DSC resources. If you do that, then as we continue to evolve this side, then you'll get integration with agents for free, right? But to do that, obviously, like I said, you got to think about better descriptions, including within the JSON schema, you have the opportunity to provide descriptions per property, things like that, have as much as possible, all natural language. Right now, I think there are models in other languages, but obviously English is probably the predominant one right now for the large language models. And then the last one is do test with DSC and MCP against your resources to see what works, what doesn't work. Please open issues and discussions in the DSC repo so we can learn from that and continue to improve it. So that, again, my goal is people who are not technically deep in DSC can still get the benefits because they can just kind of describe in natural language what they want to happen from a settings management perspective. And then the agent with MCP can take care of that. So if you didn't understand a lot of stuff I'm talking about, these are the key takeaways anyways. DSCv3 is the way to configure systems. DSC is the way to expose your application settings. Agentic software, so agentic meaning that software that is enabled to work with agents is already here, right? Obviously, this is going to continue to grow and improve over time. But I would say start thinking about how to get on board. And then you get MCP integration for free via DSCv3 for your resources.